We've got a quick brain teaser question for you guys, which is going to be entered into the chat, and you're welcome to answer through the chat. And that is, how many cells, microbiome cells, non-human cells, are there on the human body, on the average human body? So if you have any guesses for that, go ahead and feel free to give us a guess there in the chat. I'll give you a clue. It's a lot. It's a big number. Anybody? Anyone want to answer that? Good job. 1 billion. Good guess. It's greater than 1 billion. It's even greater than 1 trillion. Dr. Rosalie, you want to share?
Sure. So the answer is actually 39 trillion cells. Bacterial cells reside in an average human body, not one that's extra infected, just a regular old human body.
Healthy human body. Okay, so let's start talking about the microbiome. Before we do, I'm going to introduce us. I'm Dr. Molly Force. I'm here with our care team from Prosper Natural Health today, Dr. Rosalie and Dr. Mary. We absolutely adore this topic. It's something that we try to bring up with our patients as part of a holistic care strategy, and something that we feel like more and more information is coming out about. Every single day we see stuff in the media, it seems like, about new scientific breakthroughs in regarding our microbiome and what it means to be humans living symbiotically with microbes. So one of the pieces I will mention here is my background's in cellular and molecular biology. It's what I studied before I went to medical school. And this is such a fast changing subject that it was really hard to even talk about all the different realms of the microbiota. So we tried to really put this together in a way that it would be usable for you guys and that you could get something tangible out of it. We're going to ask that questions are held till the end as far as answering them, but if they come up for you, put them in your chat so that we don't forget to address them, because this is a pretty exciting topic. So today we're hoping to really cover how to recognize an imbalance of the microbiome and what it means for you if you do have an imbalance, like why that's so important for us to be paying attention to. We also want you to be able to understand different ways that we can actually evaluate this and clinically measure what's going on with your unique flora. And then we want you guys to walk away with what we call health hacks, which are just these great tips that you can be starting to incorporate into your life that can be really helpful for your microbiome. So the first question, of course, is what is the microbiome? And really, it's our personal flora. So if we break down the word probiotic, which many of you, of course, have heard, pro means for, biotic means life. So these are microbes which are required for a healthy life, for life. And the question of where are these microbes? And the answer is everywhere on the surface of our human bodies. So I like to think of humans like donuts. We've got this gastrointestinal tract that goes through, this digestive tract that's kind of like the hole. And we have surface all the way around the donut. And every surface of that outer layer of the donut is covered in these microbes, and different areas have different important environmental pH balances that are set to do certain activities, and that's going to attract different subsets of these microbes, of especially these bacteria. So when we think about this donut glazed and maybe sprinkled in some areas, we want to start breaking down the different regions and recognizing that if we have an imbalance in the environment in any of those regions, then that's going to affect our microbes. And these microbes are deeply protective for us. So when we're thinking about the microbiome, we're talking not just about bacteria, but also about funguses. viruses. And we're going to focus the most on those today. But we're also talking about what you see here, these protozoa and then viruses. So it's kind of like a little square as far as the different types of microbes that are involved. And even though we often associate the idea of like viruses as dangerous, they are part of our natural microbiome, as is bacteria and fungus and protozoa. So we want to be thinking about all of those and the balance between them. So how do you get inoculated with your microbiome? We are truly inoculated. And so what that means is, just if we think about that donut that comes out of the oven, if we are stamping it or glazing it and it's coming in contact with those toppings, the same thing is happening with our bodies whenever we're coming in contact with these microbes. Now, of course, they're too small to see, but at birth, we don't have much of an inoculation prior to birth while we're in the mother's womb. We know that there is some evidence of potential microbes starting to colonize the bacterial tract in the digestive system, but this is all kind of newer information and things that we're still trying to understand as scientists as far as how those microbes are transported there. But generally, we think of ourselves as fairly sterile. And then as we go through that birth canal, depending on the type of birth, we are inoculated with these microbes. So think about, take a second and think, was I a vaginal birth or a C-section birth? And that's going to indicate a difference in where you were initially inoculated with your own microbiome. And there's lots of studies that show a difference in the types of microbes that are predominant for C-section birth babies versus vaginal birth babies. And additionally, we see that there's foods that come in early on in life, and a lot of that's breast milk, but sometimes it's formula. And that's going to also inoculate the internal tract, that inner part of the donut, if you will, with the microbes. So we also know that breast milk in particular has a really cool thing where microbes from the mom's gut actually migrate through their body out through the milk, which is kind of amazing. And that was also a newer discovery in the last, I'd say, 5 years or so. They started to really talk about that. So there's some pretty amazing things that happen in these first 6 months. And when we think about the environment in which the baby is born into, that also is going to play a major role, whether it's a hospital birth or a home birth, or more of an emergent birth out in the world. So we also continue to inoculate ourselves as young children and babies with our hands coming to our mouth, any interaction in birth. And during that early childhood development, it should be said that it's really critical to be thinking about that microbiome developing, because we know from research that it can really affect chronic disease and the immune system tolerance for the rest of that child's life. So there is the theory about dirt, and we see in the literature that exposure to dirt and animals, pets in the house like dogs, those exposures to microbes at an early age can really help create more of a variety of microbes that the person is hosting and help keep them healthier in regards to their immune response. We see less allergies, less asthma, that kind of thing long-term, and less autoimmunity. So how do we maintain the microbiome? We want to think about being a good host. So I like to think about a dinner party. We want to make sure that the environment's right. So we're thinking about everything from our skin to our mucous membranes, making sure we have the right pH, and the different things that we do day to day as humans can really affect that. So different skin products that we use, the environment that we find ourselves in regards to chemicals, air, certain air exposure, that kind of thing can really affect our microbiome. And then of course, the foods that we eat, especially when we're thinking about the GI tract, that internal part of that donut being so critical for feeding and fueling these microbes and setting that pH. We also want to think about ways that we can really support our healthy mucous membranes. Our mucous membranes are very important barrier systems for us, but they also host these microbes. And we want to think about really feeding our friendly microbes. So That's where the concept of prebiotics come in. Now, we already broke down the word probiotic and said pro means for and biotic is life. So those are our good bacterial microbes that are good for us. But when we think about the word prebiotic, it means before. So it's what we need to host these bacteria in regards to the food sources that they need. So when we think about the microbiome, it is absolutely essential. So this is why we even care to talk about this, is that we consider it a true determinant of health. We see in studies time after time that the more greater biodiversity in our microbiome, the better clinical outcomes for patients with illness, and also the lower the rate of mortality. So we really love our good microbes. They protect us. It also turns out that they have quite a bit of control that we often think that us as humans might have, but actually it's these microbiomes that are kind of running the show. So we know that these microbes regulate our immune response. They can regulate our tissue pH. They can regulate how well we absorb foods and nutrients. They can regulate our metabolism. We know that diabetes can be directly linked with metabolic function in regards to the microbiome. They dictate how quickly we age. They can affect our cell division, and this is a big deal when we're talking about cancer prevention. They can affect our cognitive function, even our mood, our cravings, and even our hormone function. So this is a big deal. We want these hosts to be healthy in the right amount and to continue to do their jobs for us. So the gut microbiome in particular is going to be a really important one that we want to focus on. And I'm going to pass this off now to Dr. Rosalie to talk about.
Thanks, Dr. Molly. So the gut microbiome, as Dr. Molly mentioned, is just one of many microbiomes in the human body, right? We've got one that lives on our skin. We've got one in our vaginal tracts. The big one that we want to focus on today is that gut microbiome. And it's ultimately, in terms of when we think about the anatomy, it's a those hollow organs and the solid organs make up our GI tract, but it's in the hollow organs that the microbiome exists. It's sort of the center of the donut, like Dr. Molly mentioned. Most cells of the human organism are actually microbial. And honestly, this number changes all the time depending on which literature I read. But the earliest literature says you've got one human cell as compared to 9 bacterial cells. That's sort of the ratio. The later literature says, well, it's maybe more like 1 to 2. Ultimately, there's just so many trillion cells, it's hard to get a sense for what that exact ratio is. The point is just that we are an organism of symbiotic cells. We are not just purely human. If we were purely human, we would not function. We would not be able to digest. We would have difficulty getting rid of infections ultimately. There's 10 to the 14th of these resident microorganisms in the gut microbiome, and it consists of all sorts of different kinds, not just bacteria, but also viruses, helpful fungi and yeasts, and protozoa, which are kind of the most archaic type of pseudobacteria, curiously enough. So again, here's this word symbiosis, which just means a mutually beneficial relationship. If you think back to high school biology, remember the anemone and the clownfish, and they sort of work together and they sort of protect each other. It's the same sort of thing with the microbiome, especially the gut microbiome. Those microbes that live inside will digest the fiber that we feed them and produce even smaller molecules known as short chain fatty acids. These smaller molecules are then food for the cells that live inside the gut. So it's just an amazing way of sort of going from a piece of kale to a short chain fatty acid if we didn't have microbes as the middleman, it would be very hard to feed our GI tract. Gut microbes also are so important when we're talking about they help with creating B vitamins and vitamin K in the GI tract, as well as breaking down amino acids, which are proteins. So it's not just sort of a digestion thing, but also helps with nutrition and being nutrient and avoiding nutrient depletion.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Rosalie. So now we know why the gut microbiome is so important. And one of your next questions may be, what makes a healthy microbiome? You know, what are the components that give us the optimal microbiome? And the interesting thing about this is that there is no one healthy microbiome profile. Each person, as Dr. Molly mentioned, develops a tolerance with a set of microbes at an early age. So that means that we all have a different microbial profile that work the best with our tissues. There are some species that tend to promote disease progression more than others, but there's an incredible diversity between people in terms of what the best microbial assemblage is. The biggest or the most clear factor that has come out in the literature is that diversity is key. So a diverse microbiome allows us to have microbes that perform different roles. So they're, some are providing the short chain fatty acids, some are providing neurotransmitters. They all have a different role that they play. It also makes them more resistant to disturbance. So if you think of a forest with a lot of different species, they're going to be a lot less easily disturbed by a beetle coming in and killing some trees, but not others. So that is also seems to be true in the microbiome. There is a benefit to having a diverse community of microbes. So another component that's really important for the health of the microbiome is a healthy GI system. So you can kind of think of this as the landscape that these organisms, that this ecosystem is living within. And they like specific parameters. So, so going through the gut, we start in the stomach. And there we need a really good secretion of hydrochloric acid. That's one of our main defense mechanisms against new microbes coming in and disturbing what's already there. We also have digestive secretions that will kill off any bacteria, any potential pathogenic bacteria that can come in through food. And so those are, our pancreatic enzymes, bile, things of that nature that are secreted into our gut as we digest our food. We also need a really good peristalsis. So peristalsis is that migration through the gut, and it's known as the migrating motor complex. And it allows us to move food, but also microbes through our gut. And if we have a slowed peristalsis, it can lead to a buildup of microbes higher up in our digestive system where we don't want them to be. Another component is a really good mucosal layer. So in the microbiome world, they like to say that good fences make good neighbors. So between that lumen, the gut lumen where you have all the microbes, and then our tissues where our immune and our nervous system is residing, we need a good barrier to kind of calm the interaction. And there's a whole other set of microbes that exist within that barrier. And then finally, we need a good intact ileocecal valve. And that is the division between the small intestine and the large intestine. And we have the majority of our microbes in the large intestine, and that's where they're happy and want to be. And there's smaller, more niche communities in the small intestine, and that valve being intact keeps them in their proper place. And sometimes after a gut inflammation or an infection, you can have these scar tissue that forms, and you can kind of distort that ileocecal valve, and that can lead to problems. So we often will have patients come in for visceral manipulation or some kind of body work to help correct that. All right, so this is a very complicated slide, but I thought it would be cool to show you the intricacy of this system. So this is showing the interaction between the intestinal microbes and our immune system. And what we see here is that when we have a healthy set of microbes, there's a decreased inflammation that is going to be happening. So as you can see here, the dendritic cells are constantly sampling the gut lumen here, and they're taking pieces of information from our gut and sending them to the rest of our body. And when we have a microbiome profile that our bodies are happy with, those dendritic cells will communicate with T regulatory cells and actually decrease inflammation. Versus when you have this dysbiosis picture where you have microbes, perhaps less microbes after you have taken antibiotics, or you have a disturbed ecosystem, there is a much more inflammatory response that's going on. And this is associated with systemic inflammation and also this, what we call leaky gut syndrome. So we can have inflammation between the cells that line our gut. And this can cause a lot of things to get across those barriers, kind of break down those fences between neighbors. And that's a situation that we want to avoid. Okay, so here's another really interesting complex interaction, and it's between the microbes and our central nervous system. So this is called the gut-brain axis, and it's one of the ways that our microbial populations can influence our energy levels, our mood, our levels of anxiety, and all of that. And there's three major highways that they communicate this information on. One is directly through the vagus nerve. So that is the part of our rest and digest nervous system that is connected to all of our major organs. And there's direct pathways where microbes will communicate with that gut nervous system and communicate to the CNS when there is a disturbance happening. There's also the circulatory system. So our gut microbes are constantly creating neurotransmitters and stimulating hormone production, and also causing that immune signaling like we saw in the last slide, and are communicating with our brains in that way. And then again, we have the immune system. Okay, so this kind of brings us back to more of the real life picture of how our microbiome is going to impact our health. So as we saw, the microbiome has a lot to do with our immune regulation. One of the main reasons why probiotics in the microbiome got so popular in recent years is because they started to give probiotics when people had a C. diff infection in the hospital. So C. diff infection is a really serious infection that often happens when people have a compromised immune system. And what they found was that the probiotics, taking pills with beneficial bacteria in them, was actually helping to keep a good, what we call a cover crop, or a good protection that prevents pathogens or weeds from growing within the gut. We also see this with inflammatory bowel disease, so that includes Crohn's and ulcerative colitis. A lot of research has gone into the relationship between the microbiome and the presence of those diseases. And what we see is that there are certain microbial assemblages that will increase your risk of developing these diseases. And by treating these, you can kind of help decrease the inflammation that is happening in the gut that's associated with these. And so lastly, we also see altered microbial assemblages in celiac disease. There's some association between obesity and metabolic syndrome in certain microbes. And then we also see that with colon cancer. So with all of these, there's no direct cause and effect correlation. It's not that one microbe is going to cause any of these conditions, but it's about the health of the ecosystem that's existing within your gut and how that's impacting your immune response over time.
Let's talk about ways to recognize this imbalance that does happen from time to time with people. And for some people, it can be this imbalance that really creates a cascade of events that can really lead to chronic disease or even eventually death. So when we're thinking about the microbiome, specifically with the gut, one of the easiest ways to know what's going on is through our stool, through our poop. So I do recommend, and we do here recommend for our patients to be paying attention to what's coming out, because it really gives us a nice amount of feedback. And a lot of you might be familiar with this stool chart. It's called the Bristol scale, and it kind of gives a numbered scale 1 through 7 to help people kind of just track what's going on with their stool. You know, ideally we want to be in that 4 zone where it's just that nice, smooth fecal matter that's passed. And we don't want it to be too dry and pelleted on that one end of the scale. And then that type 7 you can see down there is just really way too loose. So both of those extremes are showing us imbalance in regards to what's going on with the microbes of the gut, or what's being impacted because of transit time. So as far as imbalances, Dr. Mary did a great job talking about these different areas that are being affected by the microbiome. When we're thinking about the gut in particular, we're worried about the microbiome being disrupted and seeing things like fatigue, especially meal-related energy changes. We also might be experiencing appetite shifts or indigestion and heartburn. Could be more gas being produced, either seeing bloating, abdominal bloating, flatulence, or belching. And then, of course, things like abdominal pain and cramping, a lot of that can be caused just secondary to the gas that's being produced by these microbes, and a diagnosis of IBS, the irritable bowel syndrome, as part of that, where we're seeing pain paired with this fluctuation in normal stool production. And then, of course, things like the constipation, diarrhea, and incomplete bowel movements, like we were just talking about. But this is, remember, just on the scale of what we see as far as gut specific related symptoms. The microbiome is so broad reaching, I mean, that we have even things like from the circulatory system, even things like hypertension, high blood pressure can be affected by the microbiome, and mood and cognitive function. So we have a lot to be looking out for when we're worried about microbiome and keeping it healthy. But this is specifically for the gut because so much of our microbiome resides in the gut. So when we're talking about weeds or opportunistic microbes that kind of steal the show if the other microbes are not there in adequate quantities, then we often will see a condition start in the small intestine in particular that is called small bowel intestinal overgrowth, which the acronym is SIBO, which many of you have heard. We've done a talk specifically on SIBO and the digestion, so make sure you jump on our website and watch that if you haven't gotten a chance to. But this is a huge topic in and of itself, but essentially what happens is we have an overgrowth of what typically would be good flora or commensal flora in the wrong area of the body. So we talked about that differentiation between the small bowel and the large intestine with that ileocecal valve. And that valve is protecting those two very different environments with two very different sets of microbes. But if the microbes from the lower intestine reflux upwards, into that small bowel, we can have this overgrowth syndrome that happens, and it can be very uncomfortable for people, causing them abdominal pain and cramping and gas and bloating, diarrhea, constipation. And we find that a lot of IBS, 60 to 80%, is actually due to small bowel intestinal overgrowth. So we've talked about IBS for years in the medical profession, and it was always kind of this diagnosis of exclusion, which means we don't know exactly what's causing it. We just know that we've ruled out all these other conditions. And now we know a lot of times it comes down to a healthy microbiome being imbalanced. So there are different types of small intestine bacterial overgrowth, SIBO. The main three subtypes that we see are producing these gases, these byproducts, and it helps us have an understanding of which microbes are in an overabundance that are now dominant. So we have either hydrogen production in excess, methane production in excess, or hydrogen sulfide, or sometimes a combination of those. And we've listed here the different bacteria and microbes, we should say, because this is actually larger than the class of just bacteria alone with that Methanobrevibacter ACA. That one is an Archaeobacter, a little bit different, but the point is each of these gases, when they come in excess, because these microbes are overgrowing, produce different symptoms. Some push more of the diarrhea and the quicker motility, and others cause slower bowel motility and more constipation with gas production. So we want to know what kinds of microbes we're treating if we're worried about an overgrowth in this arena. And so we do like to do certain testing to help us understand that. Breath tests are considered our gold standard for that at this point. So there are all these predisposing factors for that good flora from the large intestines to be coming up into the small bowel where we don't want them to be. And we see that with certain medications that slow motility. Many of us can associate times that we had to take opioids or pain medications because of surgery or something like that, and having constipation as a secondary side effect. That's a really common trigger for this type of issue, this type of dysbiosis. Chronic antibiotic use can do this. Syndromes where people are having excess vomiting or that pushing action of pushing the actual microbes, the contents from that large bowel into that small bowel. We see this issue with our acid blocking medications, because when we're blocking that hydrochloric acid, we're changing the pH of the stomach and therefore changing the pH of the next step down, which is the small intestine. And so that invites a whole new host of microbes to grow. And then we also see this with long-term steroid use, and of course with people who've had surgeries to that abdominal area, because that can often affect motility. So when we talk about antibiotics, they kind of, it's kind of like the good, bad, and the ugly. Sometimes there is a time and a place, and it's really important. If we have dysbiosis, which means, this abnormal flora level that's affecting our symbiotic balance, then a lot of times we will need to use antimicrobials. And At the same time, if we're using antimicrobials when it's not necessary, or we're using a broad spectrum antimicrobial when we could be using a more narrowed one, and it ends up affecting different regions of our body's microbiome, then we can have a lot of damage. In regards to something like SIBO, where we have this very specific overgrowth in the GI of these microbes, we often are looking towards natural herbal antimicrobials like garlic extract, which is allicin, berberines, which comes from Oregon grape or golden seal. Neem has a lot of good research behind it. Sometimes oregano oil or caprylic acid is used, and uva ursi is another herb that will be used sometimes for that. The alternative is to use certain antibiotics that are pharmaceutical grades. So rifaximin, Xifaxan is the one that's most commonly used and is in the literature for use with small bowel intestinal overgrowth. So the point that we wanted to really make here is that there can be a time and a place. We want to make sure that opportunistic bacteria and pathogenic bacteria that have overgrown are addressed. And sometimes that does require antimicrobial use, but excess antimicrobial use, of course, is going to impact the rest of the good guys.
Thanks, Dr. Molly. So that's sort of a big overview of the GI microbiome. There's many other very important microbiomes I just want to quickly touch upon in this slide. We will address these later on in future doc talks, but it's worth having a conversation about the other microbiomes besides the GI tract one. For example, the vaginal microbiome is so important, not just in childbirth as a way to inoculate the infant's new GI microbiome, but also throughout life, because lactobacilli are actually the species of bacteria that reside in the vagina in the highest amount and maintain it at a nice low acidic pH to thus prevent infections, etc. The skin microbiome is another absolutely huge one. Without these skin microbes kind of living on all portions of the skin in different amounts, it would be very hard for us to fend off infections like MRSA. So they are helpful. They're symbiotic again, even in that area of the body. They educate the immune system, right? Our skin is our largest organ. So having helpful bacteria on the skin is a feedback loop for our immune system to say, yes, we like these bacteria and we don't like these other ones. In terms of the nasal and respiratory tree, there is also about 1 million bacterial cells that get breathed in per cubic meter of air every day, right? So that's a lot of interaction with different bacteria. We're not even talking about viruses here, right? So an imbalance in the respiratory tree microbiome, especially in the sinuses, these sort of pockets in the face, are implicated with a lot of respiratory symptoms, from seasonal allergies to asthma to chronic sinusitis. There can even be a type of overgrowth called MARCoNS, which is something we'll talk about. How do we test that later, which is highly implicated with ill health. It's sort of downstream, not just in the sinuses. So here's the section of the doc talk where we talk about how do we evaluate this microbiome, right? And now we're sort of going back to our GI tract. Ultimately, the first thing we do, the first line, is we just look at the patient in front of us. Physically, what's going on? What are the symptoms? Is there bloating? Is there chronic postnasal drip, right? Then we can sort of assess from a biochemical perspective what's going on potentially in the GI tract. And also, as Dr. Molly mentioned, the microflora are very strongly implicated with our emotional states and stability. So that's another piece that we look at closely. Second piece of evaluation when we're not totally sure or we want to get some clear data here is our stool panel. And ultimately, there's a lot of different stool panels one can do, but the stool tells us specifically about what's going on in the GI tract microbiome. That is because the stool is made up of a bulk of dead bacterial cells, right? So if we analyze the stool, we know what's going on upstream. So it tells us if there's a microbial overgrowth, it tells us if there's inflammation, it tells us if we're digesting the foods we put inside well or not. It tells us if there's a potential leaky gut picture. And so to evaluate our stool, we can go through the regular old Quest or LabCorp site and do what's known as an O&P ×3, which stands for ova and parasite, where we're just looking at are there eggs and are there worms in the stool, right? There would be just a very specific time and place for this kind of test. It would indicate an overgrowth of those parasites, but I wouldn't necessarily run this test unless someone has been traveling recently and has sort of watery stools, right? The ones that are more useful here for this conversation have to do with both a stool culture test and a PCR test. So the stool culture test grows out, takes a piece of the stool and grows out, see what grows ultimately. And this tells us a lot about, what is viable on the inside. And Genova is one of the labs that we use here that would assess that way. The other type of test that we use probably most commonly, it's one of my favorite ones for this specific assessment, is the PCR test, which is just the lab techs look at a piece of stool and will analyze what DNA is in the stool. And we're talking about not so much human DNA, but we're talking about bacterial DNA, viral DNA, parasitic DNA, right? It sort of gives us all of the possibilities and in what ratio and number they exist. So here's an example of what that GI map PCR test looks like. And this is a 6-page report, right? And this is just the very, very beginning of it. It talks about potential pathogenic bacteria. These are not our helpful commensal bacteria. These are the ones that overgrow when we are very ill. C. diff being one you've perhaps heard of that happens in hospitals when there's big outbreaks of GI illness, especially after a lot of patients have been taking a lot of antibiotics. So this is just one of the examples. Here's the Genova test, which lays out the information in a similar way, but a little bit more visual, where you can see on the bottom there, it gives us colors and categories where we're looking at, not just infection from pathogens, from pathogenic bacteria, but also what is the dysbiosis, right? What's going wrong with the microbiome? Remember that word dysbiosis. Dys means bad and biosis means life. So what are the sort of bacteria that are overgrowing in a monoculture that are not conducive to an asymptomatic healthy life, right? Other markers would be inflammation and maldigestion and metabolic downstream effects. I'll hand this off to Dr. Mary.
Thank you, Dr. Rosalie. Okay, so next we're going to talk about the breath tests. We're often using these when we suspect bacterial overgrowth in the small intestine. And these are those bacterial overgrowths are often associated with a lot of bloating as the main symptom, and then often diarrhea and constipation. So this is a test that uses a lactulose solution that is then fermented in your gut, and then over the course of a few hours, you are taking regular samples to see at what levels your gut microbes are fermenting those sugars, and that can tell you what kinds of gut microbes are present. The main gases that we're looking for are hydrogen, methane, and hydrogen sulfide. And what we look for is a spike in these before a certain amount of time that would, so there's a certain transit time that by which those sugars go from your mouth to your large intestine. And so we're looking for that increase before it gets there. So this is just another graph where you can see the positive tests where you have a drastic increase in those sugars a certain amount of time after taking that sugar solution. Oh, sorry, those gases after taking that sugar solution. And we can test for all 3 gases now, which is very exciting. And 2 of them are associated more with diarrhea and 1 with constipation. And as Dr. Molly said, often you can see these co-occurring. All right, so we also, as many of us have mentioned in this talk, we have many other different microbiomes so that we often want to investigate. So we're usually using this when we have recurrent infections. So if you have 1 upper respiratory tract infection or 1 vaginal infection, not so much. But when you start to see it happen over time, we start to wonder about a microbial imbalance. And so we can use this for chronic vaginal infections, for chronic UTIs or other diseases of the renal tract or the kidneys and bladder. We can use a skin scrape test to test wounds or kind of chronic non-healing skin infections. We can do this in the respiratory tract for persistent colds and sinusitis. And then we can also do it for nails. So we're often doing it for when there's a complicated infection of the nail. And these tests are, like I said, really good for chronic infections and also really good for testing for antimicrobial resistance. So when you've had all these chronic infections and have taken antibiotics time after time, and you start to develop microbes that don't respond to the antimicrobials anymore, to the antibiotics anymore, these tests are really useful for that.
I'll also just say that these tests have been a game changer in clinical practice because they're using PCR. They're not a guessing game anymore or a game of culturing the microbe on the right media. So what that means is we have very accurate results for people and we're not guessing what antimicrobial is going to work for them anymore. It can be paired up right there for us once we have that information of who's overgrown or who's even present. So it's pretty cool. We get a lot of data and it's accurate, which is lovely. So as far as health hacks, I know that's one of the reasons why a lot of you guys are here is how do we take this wonderful microbiome that we have and make sure that it stays balanced, stays healthy, or bring it back into balance. So the real question is, how do we become a good host? So our first health hack today is to make sure our diet is low in sugar. So Americans eat way too much sugar. This was illustrated to me this holiday with my kiddos. It's just amazing how much we can pack in, and it drastically affects our microbiome. And this has been shown in the literature time and time again, that if we are feeding excessive amounts of sugar to our microbiome, then it will change the composition of those microbes very quickly within 20 minutes of that food coming in. So pretty wild. Now, we also want to think, when we're thinking about our next health hack, about chemical substances and food additives, things like that can be damaging our microbes. So we want to remove what we call these obstacles to cure. So these things that are going to be affecting our microbes, that our microbes are really not designed to be around. So when we're thinking about our food choices, making sure that we're having clean, organic, foods and really avoiding those synthetic chemicals. We know, once again, from the studies that artificial sweeteners and artificial colors can affect the GI microbes, and we know that preservatives can affect them as well. So really reading those labels, trying to choose foods, and if you're having animal based foods like dairy, eggs, meat, fish, those kind of things, poultry, choosing ones that are not being fed antibiotics, and really just watching out for all of these synthetic chemicals, including our plastics. And for our bodies, we're thinking about watching out for the fragrances and the cosmetics that could be causing damage, and same with the cleaning products around us. So really doing a nice review of what your microbiome is coming in contact with on a daily basis.
So our health hack number 3 is to include prebiotics, right? So prebiotics predate, they're sort of the food for our probiotics, okay? So this is sort of a concept we've already discussed here. Prebiotics, again, are just food for our healthy microbiome. They feed those beneficial bacteria, and sources of prebiotics include garlic, onions, whole grains, fruits and vegetables. If this is a list that you sort of scrunch your eyebrows at and think, oh, well, these foods actually aggravate my symptoms, that's usually a sign of dysbiosis and maybe even potentially SIBO. So this is something worth just checking for yourself. So these prebiotics are found in a lot of different places. And again, I want you to look at this list and think to yourself, what of these prebiotics are you actually adding into your daily diet, right? We're talking mushrooms, algae, seaweed, oats, and then all sorts of root vegetables and whole wheats and barleys. If you're not getting prebiotics, it's hard to feed the microbiome accurately and efficiently enough. So prebiotics can be found in many forms, all right? When we talk about prebiotics, we talk about fiber most typically. And there's 2 types of fiber. There's our soluble fibers that sort of create gels in the GI tract and line the lining with a nice mucus, and also are readily transformed into those short chain fatty acids later on. And then there's insoluble fibers, which are kind of the roughage. There's the kale stems, right? They sort of move through the body and add bulk to our stool, helping that migrating motor complex, helping the peristalsis, helping ultimately with bowel movements every day. Guar gum is on here because it's a SIBO-friendly fiber, in that it's soluble and it doesn't aggravate a dysbiosis that is related to SIBO. If you've come in for a visit, we've likely talked about guar gum with you.
Okay, so another way to support your microbiome through your diet is by getting these really tasty and exciting antioxidants in called polyphenols. So these are found in fruits and berries and chocolate and black tea and red wine. And they are all sources of, again, what we call antioxidants, which help quench free radicals and mitigate any effects of inflammation in your gut. And they've been shown to promote a favorable microbial profile. All right, and next we have eating probiotic-rich foods. So I personally love to have some sauerkraut and kimchi in my fridge at all times and put a little spoonful of each in each meal. And they're just really amazing because they're just this kind of ongoing dietary source of both prebiotics and probiotics. Other sources of probiotics in food you can get from yogurt, kefir, kombucha, miso, and tempeh. And for all of these, they're all fermented, all have live bacteria, so it's great to get raw, unpasteurized forms.
Health hack number 6 is going to be supplemental probiotics. And as you guys know, not all supplements are created equal. And that's very apparent when we're thinking about the live Flora supplements. So one of the things that is very true for our culture is that we have way less fermented foods in our diet than we used to. And some of that has to do, I believe, with, food storage stability, the ability to have refrigerators that are beck and call, that kind of thing. But ultimately, that means that we're having less of these cultured foods that Dr. Mary was just going over with us. And so sometimes it's really important to make sure that we're getting a daily probiotic in. And these probiotics really, in my opinion, should be chosen with your healthcare practitioner so that they can understand what is going on with your specific needs. There are probiotics that are designed for certain metabolic periods of our life, even that are designed to help with certain things like mood and cognition, and then others that are designed more for gut health. And when we think about the supplemental probiotics, the best studied ones are bacterial and yeast or fungal base. And they kind of come in different categories. I think about them as the human live strains, so the ones that are being cultured originally from human that are actually human flora, and then others that are being cultured initially from animals. So, and then there's some that are being cultured from soil and veggies and other non-animal kingdom starting points. So when we're thinking about that, most of the over-the-counter probiotics are not human specific. And that's a big deal when we're trying to make a big difference for somebody's immune response. And we want them to have these cultures that we're inviting in, because we're inviting them to our dinner party. And we want to make sure that we're getting microbes that are actually going to work. The other thing to think about with microbes is we want to think about how they've been treated and transport from the lab that created them and then until they got to you, because they often need to be refrigerated and they're living. So they need to have certain conditions in order to survive that transit. We also want to think about which strains have been chosen. If we're taking something orally, it needs to be a strain of microbe that we know can survive through that upper GI tract if it's supposed to be a lower GI flora. So at our apothecary here at Prosper, we're really, really picky, especially with our backgrounds, for getting microbes that are human specific whenever possible, unless we're looking for a flora that's coming from a soil-based microbial donor. So we want to make sure that we are delivering this in a form that will work for the patient too. So we have creams and topicals that can be used vaginally and on other skin areas, as well as suppositories. And then of course, orally, we give those as well. And these are just some of the brands that we really love and use here. So the next health hack is self-care. And this is a big deal that is often glossed over, but we want to make sure that we are supporting our exercise, our sleep, our stress management, because we know, according to the literature, that these make a big difference for our microbiome. So I want you guys to remember that analogy of a dinner party. We want the environment to be one that your guests like being at. So be a good host and really making sure that we're taking that time daily to get our movement in, that we're making sure to have a practice that allows for stress management, and then making sure that we're really prioritizing quality and quantity of sleep. So I'm going to have Dr. Rosalie talk about Ayurvedic medicine because that's her subspecialty. And then we'll go into the Chinese medicine options with Dr. Mary.
Thanks, Dr. Molly. So yeah, this is the exciting sort of last 5 minutes of our talks here that sort of transition from the naturopathic to the Eastern medical traditions. And like Dr. Molly said, my subspecialty is in Ayurvedic medicine. Dr. Mary's is in traditional Chinese medicine and acupuncture. So when it comes to Ayurvedic medicine, it's curious when we think about the microbiome, it's not really something that translates very well, but abdominal illnesses definitely are something that are talked about in Ayurveda. And Ayurveda is our traditional medicine from India. It means the science of life ultimately. And so when we talk about IBS, irritable bowel syndrome, SIBO, or indigestion, that's sort of the angle we take from these Eastern medical modalities. And the root cause here, as per Ayurveda, is a concept known as low Agni. And Agni is your digestive fire, right? It's that campfire. How well is it digesting the logs that it's being given? Is it too hot or is it too cold or too wet, right? So low Agni is poor digestive fire. The treatments would be to build that Agni, to stoke that fire, to normalize bowel movements, and also incorporate regular fasting and cleanses into the diet, which is something in the Western world we're not accustomed to. So here's a couple quick little Ayurvedic treatments to increase that Agni. You want to add warming spices to everything. And the key is warming spices, not hot spices, right? Warming spices are things like ginger, cardamom, turmeric, right? As compared to like chili powder, right? Warming spices help warm up your food and build that Agni. Also important here is to monitor your portion sizes. If we're just stuffing ourselves, it's really hard for our digestive enzymes and for our digestive fire to digest all of that food appropriately and not leave anything that will then get fermented by our microbiome ultimately. Especially if there is a monoculture or dysbiosis. In Ayurveda, snacking is really looked down upon. The grazing diet is really not something that gets recommended. So ultimately, this is sort of the Ayurvedic recommendation to avoid snacking so that your GI tract can sort of rest between meals and we're not having that leftover fermentables. And then a clear way to monitor your Agni is to see whether you're having clear burps before meals. And this is sort of a curious Ayurvedic concept. If your Agni is high and you're having clear burps, it sort of means that there's nothing fermenting on the inside. We're ready to add something new. So that's a interesting little key there. To check in with for yourself and your own digestion. Herbal medicine wise, big one in Ayurveda is a combination of 3 herbs into a powder known as Triphala. It's sort of our downward moving, it has a downward moving energetic. You could take half a teaspoon before bed as a starting dose. And the big piece here is it helps with normalizing bowel movements. And then lastly, regular fasts and cleanses can be seen in all sorts of different forms. The big one I end up recommending for a lot of patients is an intermittent fast, where we're just extending that nighttime fast on both ends of the clock, where we're eating dinner a little earlier and eating breakfast a little later, if not skipping altogether. Again, this is something to discuss with your primary care provider. But other ways Ayurvedically to incorporate these fasts and cleanses are to do mono diets or seasonal cleanses. A khichdi mono diet is a really big one in Ayurveda. And then lastly, the big bad cleanse known as panchakarma, the 5 cleansing techniques in Sanskrit, is one that gets recommended, and something I have used with SIBO patients in the past as a way of treating their SIBO, is a full body reset ultimately.
Thank you, Dr. Rosalie. Okay, so next we'll talk about traditional Chinese medicine. So this is a system of medicine based on theories of a 5-element theory. There are 5 major organs, each are associated with an element, and those organs are connected to the acupuncture meridians that whereby energy will flow throughout the body. So within traditional Chinese medicine, again, similar to Ayurvedic medicine, was not a concept of microbes at the time, but they did see a lot of digestive issues, constipation, diarrhea, and bloating. So when it comes to the patterns that they recognized within traditional Chinese medicine for those conditions, there's a number that you see here. The spleen is the organ that's associated with digestion. It allows us to absorb our nutrients from our food. And when the spleen is not working properly, it doesn't have enough qi, we call that spleen qi deficiency. And that can lead to loose stools and bloating and just a lot of kind of fatigue related to that. We also see liver qi stagnation, which is very often associated with stress, can lead to poor digestion. The liver is the organ in traditional Chinese medicine that allows blood and qi to flow freely throughout the body. And when it gets overwhelmed, it can kind of bully other organs, and it can really impact the spleen and the digestive process. So cold is another sort of condition that does not help our digestion. We want our digestive system to be warm, similar to in the Ayurvedic model of the Agni and the fire. So you can have cold in the middle jiao. The middle jiao is the area of the body that pertains to digestion. It's kind of known, interestingly, as like the fermenter. And then we also can see damp heat in the intestines, and that's usually associated with a bacterial infection. And we'll talk more about that next. So in terms of treating bacterial overgrowth, Chinese medicine has long used, well, they didn't recognize it as bacterial overgrowth, but they sort of saw the patterns and used these herbs since ancient times. And here we have what we call the 3 yellow brothers. And these are Chinese skullcap, coptis, and another one called huangbai. And all 3 of them contain a substance that we use in Western medicine to as an herbal antimicrobial called berberine, also found in Oregon grape and a number of local herbs. And these 3 work together to clear heat. Like we were saying, that heat is associated with bacterial infections, and kind of cool the digestive tract to clear the heat that accumulates. They're very bitter and terrible tasting, but very effective. So again, one of our main goals on a daily basis to support digestion in absence of an infection is to eat warm cooked food. You really want to kind of support the digestive fire with that warm food. And also, again, similar to Ayurvedic medicine with those aromatic herbs and spices. So cinnamon, cloves, cardamom, and ginger are all going to heat up the digestive tract. And then lastly, I love to use acupuncture for any digestive complaints that people come in with. And I often think of acupuncture, when there's a nervous system component to whatever someone is dealing with. And, we discussed that gut-brain axis before. So really has a really huge impact on gut function. And so I think of it as kind of working within that system. All right, so here's our plug for a doc talk that's going to be happening in early March, where I'm going to give an introduction to acupuncture and Chinese medicine. So we'll talk about 5-element theory. We'll talk about the meridians that we use for acupuncture, the basics of Qi and blood and all of the theories that are fundamental to Chinese medicine. And then we'll also talk about Chinese herbal medicine, which is a very vast, exciting topic.
We also want to invite you all to our doc talk that's going to be happening in February. It's going to be very on point for Valentine's Day, because we're going to be talking about boosting libido and managing menopause. So please join us for that. There should be sign up links on our website that should go live sometime this week. So we're looking forward to that. Does anyone have questions? We know that this is a huge topic. Let's see.
I just put in the chat a reminder that if you do want to see any of our previous doc talks, we have replay links on our website, for example, and also if you're might be missing the upcoming doc talks, you can always reference it after the fact. It's just a link to click on if you're interested.
Yeah, and if you had to log off early today or something like that, you can go on and rewatch this one, which will be posted later on this week. Additionally, we have, talks about stress management, which we kind of discussed a little bit today, and sleep. So don't miss those important portions too, because all of that plays into how well we can host our microbiome. So if you all have questions that are more specific, or if you're interested in testing, which really helps us understand which good guys you're colonized with, or what kind of overgrowth you might be experiencing, or undergrowth, so we can really pair you with the proper probiotics, please reach out to us. You can request an appointment online through our website, or give us a ring and we'll get you set right up with a consult, and we can do that testing and get to the bottom of what's going on with you guys. So we really appreciate you joining us today. It's just our pleasure, and we hope you all stay safe.
Bye, thank you.
Bye, have a good one.